Let me welcome our chief guest of today's valedictory function section, Dr. GANESH UMAKANT THITE, the most respected and honored professor and an eminent scholar of international repute, to deliver the valedictory paper on aspects of Vedic studies. We are very eagerly waiting to hear your words of wisdom. Over to Dr. Thithe.
Okay. So friends, in the very beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of this international conference, and particularly I am very much thankful to my friend Professor Murli Madhavan for having so much trouble in organizing this seminar and allowing me to participate in this seminar. So now I am going to read a paper on the aspects of Vedic studies. Due to the antiquity of Vedic literature and due to many archaisms in the language and style, the difficulty in understanding the meaning of the Veda was recognized at a very early date. Naturally, attempts were also made towards the understanding of the Veda. Collection and edition of scattered mantras can be considered a very primary attempt towards the interpretation of the Rig Veda. The hymns are classified and arranged on the basis of their authorship, that is Rishi, and their subject matter, that is Devata. These two principles form an important role in the process of Samhitiikarana. Padapaatha, that is analysis of the words on the basis of dissolution of sandhis, is also an important next step towards the interpretation of Rig Veda and other samhitas. Unless one understands the meaning and form of avasaya, one will not be able to split the word. Thus, if the word is a gerund of ava plus so, there will be an avagraha in between ava and saya. But if it is a dative singular of the word avasa, there will be no avagraha in the Padapaatha. Thus, the author of Padapaatha also must have tried to understand the meaning of the Veda, at least to a certain extent. The Braahmana-texts also try to interpret some formulae which they prescribe to be used in ritual with intention to justify their use. This can be called ritualistic or yajnika type of explanation. The Vedangas, particularly Nirukta and Vyakarana, Ashtadhyayi of Panini, are directly or indirectly connected with the interpretation of the Veda. In Nirukta, there is an important discussion on the meaningfulness of the Veda. While Kautsa was of the opinion that the mantras are meaningless, Yaska, the author of Nirukta, strongly opposed this view. It, however, seems that has not been properly understood by Yaska as well as by the students of Nirukta in general. Yaska ridicules Kautsa by saying that it is not the fault of a post if a blind man does not see it. This ridicule is also not correct, for Kautsa does not mean that the mantras are literally meaningless, as would appear from his expression anarthakaha vai mantraha. What he means is that not the mantras, but the meanings of the mantras are meaningless. Thus, when Kautsa argues that there are some contradictions in the meanings of the mantras, or when he points out that there are some verses which are very difficult to understand, he accepts that there is some meaning of the mantras. The meaning, however, is not worth understanding, and therefore the view of Yaska that one should try to understand the meaning of Veda with the help of Nirukta methodology does not deserve any serious attention. In the course of history, Kautsa's views seem to have been successful, for the priests used to study the mantras by heart without ever paying attention to the meaning of the Veda. Thus, Kautsa appears to be an Ur. Yaska has mentioned some schools of Vedic interpretation. The most important among them are the Nairuktas and the Aitihasikas. While the Nairuktas are more interested in the etymologies, the Aitihasikas considered everything mentioned in the Rigveda to be real. Thus, according to the Nairuktas, Vritra stands for a cloud because the word is connected with the root vru, to cover, and cloud covers the sun, etc. The Aitihasikas considered Vritra to be the son of Twashtru and thus a demon. According to the Aitihasikas, the proper names refer to the real personalities. Thus, it seems that they do not make any difference between the imaginary characters and the real ones. In other words, for them, the stories and history are not different from each other. The Nirukta is mainly interested in the etymologies of the words, and therefore it has given the principles of etymology. The most important principles among them are as follows. One should never say no to give an etymology. One should try to give an etymology remaining firm to the meaning. One need not pay attention to the rules of formation and the accent. In the very early stage of science, these principles are indeed very helpful, but they are rather too simplistic and not very scientific at the advanced level. It is possible to have some preconceived notion first, and then a route suitable to that meaning may be found out. The etymologies based on these principles may at times lead to any desirable meanings, and this would not remain trustworthy. Yaska himself has said that one should give prominence to the meaning and the grammatical rules may be neglected. This has given rise to fanciful etymologies. Thus, for example, it is obvious that the word Rushi contains the root Rusha. So the meaning of the word Rushi is leader, because the word Rush means to go forward. But because Yaska has assumed the meaning seer of this word, he artificially connects it with the root Drusha. This is a result of the principles of etymology given by Yaska himself. The medieval commentators like Saayana are the faithful followers of Yaska. In the commentary of Saayana, whatever meaning is convenient at a particular place has been given. This has resulted into two facts. One, multiplicity of meaning of the same word at different places, and secondly, anachronism. Saayana interprets the Rigveda as if it were produced in his time. So all the philosophical and ritual progress in the time of Saayana has been reflected in the commentary of Saayana while interpreting the Rigveda. Since the followers of Saayana also think anachronistically, they do not notice this peculiarity of him. In the modern period, That is approximately for the last 2 centuries, we find that there are 2 streams of Vedic interpretations simultaneously, Indian as well as Western. These 2 ways of interpretations can be described in 2 words, fruit-oriented and root-oriented. The Indian way of Vedic interpretation has remained fruit-oriented, and this is in conformity with the Yaska's guiding principle, Artha Nityaha Pariksheta. The Indian interpreters have always used the Vedas to solve their problems in their own period. While up to the first half of the 20th century, Indian interpreters gave more importance to philosophy. During the last 5 decades, they are giving more stress on science and technology on one hand, and the relevance of Veda from the point of view of social and political life on the other. The scholars of the first half of the 20th century used to say that in Western world, there had been some material progress based on science and technology, but still the people there are not happy. They do not have mental peace. For this mental peace, they have to turn to India and to read Upanishads, Gita, etc. During the last 40 years, Indian Vedologists seem to have forgotten mental peace. They are trying to find out modern science and technology in the Veda. Moreover, they are also trying to find ecology in the Veda. It is very noteworthy that as and when new information comes forward through newspapers, Indian Vedic scholars find it in the Veda. In the 19th century, they could find railways in the Veda. In the first half of the 20th century, they could find aeroplanes and atom bombs in the Veda. In the last quarter of the 20th century, they started finding out computer and ecological awareness in the Veda. Recently, in the 21st century, they are finding mobile phones in the Veda. So the science and technology in the Veda, according to the Vedic scholars of India, have 2 limitations. First, the science and technology should first be developed in the West, and secondly, this science and technology should have some news value. Further, this science and technology should be childish, that even children should be able to use it. The complicated details of science and technology cannot be found out in the Veda, for these Vedic scholars do not know them. Moreover, only those things which are relevant even today are found in the Veda. Thus, during the British period, Vedic scholars in India found out nationalism in the Veda. Frankly speaking, the concept of nation and nationalism are foreign to India. The word Rashtra in the Veda does not mean nation, but rather state. Indian authors on political science in ancient India do not make any difference between state and nation as the Western authors do. Since in modern days we accepted the word Rashtra in Sanskrit for nation, this does not mean that the word existed in that sense in ancient days. To see the concept of nation in Rashtra will thus be anachronistic. Similarly, the concept of ecology, pollution, etc. are modern. They have no history of more than 50 years, even in the Western way of thinking. Therefore, to find these things in Sanskrit or in Veda is anachronistic. Just as a healthy man is not aware of the fact that he has heart or brain, Vedic men were also not aware of ecology because there was no pollution, no ecological problems. Even though there are some descriptions of rivers, mountains, trees, birds, etc. in Sanskrit literature, there is no word for nature in Sanskrit. There was no concept of nature in Sanskrit literature at all. Western critics praise Kalidasa for his description of nature, but no Indian critic of earlier days has ever praised Kalidasa for this. for there was no concept of nature at all in ancient days. There is a relevance mania among the Indian thinkers and leaders in order to show that everything in ancient days is relevant even today. They anachronistically find modern problems and solutions to them in Vedic or classical Sanskrit literature. This is not logical. The fruit-oriented Indian interpretation of Veda or any other ancient literature, therefore, is not scientific. It reflects a primitive mentality on the part of the scholars. With this background in mind, we may compare the Western point of view towards Vedic interpretation. It can be summarized in the word root-oriented. The Western interpreters always try to seek the original meaning of the Vedic text, irrespective of the fact that it may or may not be relevant today. Incidentally, it may be noted that in the Sanskrit language, there is no word for the concept original. No Indian scholar tries to claim that he is original, even when he is original. He only claims to be a faithful interpreter or something what has been already said in the earlier text or taught by his teacher. In the absence of awareness of any history for an Indian thinker, Veda is considered to be Nitya. It was as it is today or will be as it is today. From the Western point of view, the Veda is a historical document, and the period of Rigveda is different from that of Yajurveda. Similarly, the Brahmana-texts, Upanishads, Vedaanga literature, epics and Puranas, classical literature may be different in their viewpoints. The Rigvedic scholars in the West try to find out what the Rigvedic poets might have thought. Rosen, the first translator of some Rigvedic hymns in Latin, immediately recognized that Saayana's interpretations are anachronistic and therefore not very reliable. The same was the position of scholars like Roth or Grassmann. Meanwhile, there was a long discussion among the Western scholars on the place of Saayana in Vedic interpretation. Scholars like Wilson were strong supporters of Saayana, and they believed that Saayana was in the line of continuous interpretations of Veda in India, and therefore he is in a better position to understand the Veda than a European scholar of 19th century. Wilson translated the entire Veda into English, and in India his translation is very much used because it is in English and not in German or French, the languages not within the reach of most of the Indian scholars. Wilson's translations were highly criticized in the West. It was pointed out that his translation is not that of Veda, but that of Saayana's commentary. Although Roth and Grassmann tried to understand Veda independently, their interpretations are also not free from objections. These two scholars also are not free from the objection called multiplicity of meanings of the same words. Moreover, they change the available text by suggesting numerous emendations. This point was also not appreciated by other scholars in the West. Ludwig and Bergaigne represent two different directions of Vedic interpretation. Ludwig used the entire Vedic literature in order to understand the Veda. He completely translated the Veda into German and added a detailed commentary. He, however, tried to find out the real history in the Veda, and in that sense, he belongs to the school of Aitihasikas mentioned by Nirukta. Bergaigne wrote a very big book on the Vedic religion in French. In this book, consisting of 3 volumes, Bergaigne used the method called rapprochement. Thus, he tried to bring all the relevant passages together, compared them with each other, and tried to decide the meaning of the Vedic words. Thus, he has indirectly translated a large part of the Veda into French. His work remained rather neglected. V.G. Paranspe has translated the work of Bergaigne from French into English almost 40 years ago. Still, his work has remained unknown in India. Pichel and Gardner wrote numerous essays on the Vedic words. They were strong supporters of Indian tradition while understanding the Veda. Pichel was a great scholar in the field of classical Sanskrit and Prakrit. So these two scholars used the entire Indian literature for understanding the Veda. Gardner, however, slightly changed his position later on. When he translated the entire Veda into German, he has simply referred to Saayana but not followed him. Oldenberg has a unique place in the history of Vedic interpretation. He wrote detailed notes on the Veda. In these notes, he criticized all the earlier attempts of Vedic interpretation. He has also followed the method of internal comparison or rapprochement while understanding the Veda. Unfortunately, he did not translate the Veda as such. His notes, however, are very important and they deal with many problematic text places in the Veda. Incidentally, let me mention that now I am translating this work from German into English, and I have already completed almost 50% of the work. Renou continued his work in the line of Oldenberg in a different way. He has translated almost 60% of the Veda in French along with up-to-date notes. He has used all the literature published up to the time of his translation. He has also used the method of internal comparison. For the time being, his translation is the best. Unfortunately, his translation does not follow the order of hymns in the Veda and is scattered in 17 volumes. Moreover, he also could not complete the translation of Veda. Contributions of scholars like Gonda are very significant. He has written numerous books and essays on the various aspects of Vedic studies. He has discussed the views of earlier scholars and tried to give systematic translation of numerous passages from the Veda. Unfortunately, again, he has also not translated the Veda in the order of the hymns in the Veda, and his views are also scattered in numerous books and articles. It is very much desired that a complete index of all the text places discussed by him is prepared in future. It may be added that Max Mueller was the editor of the Veda with Saayana's commentary. His contributions are important from the point of view of history of religion, but for the interpretation of the Veda, he has not contributed much. H.D. Velankar from Mumbai has also translated almost 70% of the Veda into English. Though Indian, his translations are in the Western tradition. He also uses the method of internal comparison while translating the Veda. His translations are also philologically root-oriented and therefore deserve to be mentioned among the Western contributions. He is quite different from other Indian interpreters. It may be observed that in India, Dayananda Saraswati, Sri Aravindo, and Madusuudana Ojha seem to have influenced most of the Vedic scholars. Therefore, in India, most of the Vedics are followers and worshippers of Veda. Their main motive is the glorification of Veda and not the study of Veda. It seems that Many Indian Vedic scholars have strong bias against Vedic scholars, against Western scholars, although they do not even know the names of Vedic scholars in the West. The same is the case with the Western scholars who do not take into consideration the writings of Indian scholars on the Veda. There are mainly two reasons for the absence of any rapport between Vedic and Western and Indian scholars. The first is the absence of knowledge of the languages. Indian scholars are hardly knowing languages other than English. Secondly, it is almost impossible for majority of the Indian scholars to get the literature published in the West due to the high prices, as also due to the ignorance of these scholars. Late R.N. Dandekar published 6 volumes of Vedic bibliography, in which he has exhaustively recorded all the literature in the field of Veda. His efforts, however, have remained unnoticed. The absence of critical attitude and of pure philological approach towards the Vedic studies is a great obstacle in the Vedic studies in India. There seems to be, thus, anarchy in the field of Vedic studies in India. To promote the philological approach to the Vedic studies is a desideratum in India. This can be achieved by means of following ways: revival of the old attitude of Indian scholars of Nishkama Vedic studies. Veda is not to be studied for any practical purpose, but for the sake of study of Veda. The books of the Western scholars in German and French should be translated into English or other Indian languages. Research papers on the Vedic subjects written in German and French also should be translated into English and other Indian languages. It should be compulsory on the part of Vedic students to study German and French. Academic philological studies by Vedic scholars and popular propagatory writings of the devotees of Veda should not be confounded with each other. Objective philological studies of Veda deserve to be encouraged. Resources of the Maharshi Sandipani Rashtriya Veda Vidyalaya should be used for such type of Vedic studies. Lectures, classes of Vedic scholars following philological methodology be encouraged. It may be noted that in India, there is the concept of Veda Pramanya, that is the authoritativeness of the Veda. This concept has religious and philosophical significance. I also notice that in India, there is another concept unknowingly accepted by the people, namely Pramana Vedatva. This means Vedaness of authoritative. Thus, whatever is regarded as authoritative by Indian people is also considered by them to be Veda. In ancient days, the Bhagavad Gita was accepted by the tradition as an Upanishad. See the colophon of this text. It is Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishadsu. So these words occur in these colophons. In modern days, people consider the writings of Shankaracharya or of some other scholars respected by them to be Vedic texts. Thus, for example, for Indians, Veda is not only eternal, it is also an open book. On the other hand, Veda is a historical document for the Western scholars. This difference of outlook also creates a great difference of opinion among the Indian and Western scholars of Veda. The Indian scholars have forgotten ancient principle, Brahmanena Nishkaranaha Shadango Vedo Dhyetavyaha Jneyascha. Thus, the Veda is to be studied without any practical purpose. But the present day Vedic scholars, trying to show the relevance of Veda, have neglected this principle. This principle, however, needs to be revived. So, thank you very much, listeners, for your patient act of listening. And I again thank the organizers of this seminar, particularly Professor Murli Madhavan, and I conclude my speech.
Thank you very much, sir, for your scholarly presentation. It
Yes.
is indeed a very highly informative and interesting lecture, especially on the various aspects of Vedic studies. We thank you very much for your gracious presence for the international seminar here. Now I invite our president of Kandalush Sabha, Sri Narayanam Putti, to present the citation to our beloved guest, Dr. G.U. Thite.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Thite, for his critical evaluation and impartial approach we were shown in his evaluation to both the Occidental and Oriental studies about Veda. I am honored and lucky that this is the second time I am giving a citation to Professor Thite after 2002. Sir,